you ever wondered what happens when love blooms in the most impossible circumstances? When two hearts find each other across enemy lines during humanity's darkest hour? What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you thought you knew about love during wartime. My name is Sarah, and for the past 3 years I've been researching forgotten stories from World War II. Stories that never made it into history books. Stories that were buried in dusty attics, hidden in secret compartments, and locked away in family vaults for over 80 years. But this story, this particular collection of letters I discovered, will absolutely blow your mind. Picture this. It's 1943, the war's raging across Europe. Nations are divided, families are torn apart, and in the midst of all this chaos, something extraordinary happens. Something that defies every rule of war, every boundary of nationality, every expectation of human behavior during conflict. What you're about to hear is the true story of Anna and Klaus. Two people who should have been enemies. Two people whose love story was so dangerous, so forbidden, that it could have cost them their lives. And the only reason we know about it today is because of a remarkable discovery made in a bombed-out building in Berlin just last year. But before I reveal what was found in that building, let me paint you a picture of just how impossible this love story really was. Anna was a nurse working in a British field hospital. Klaus was a German soldier captured during a raid in northern France. By every measure of war, by every rule of engagement, by every social expectation of the time, they were supposed to hate each other. Yet somehow, against all odds, they fell in love. And they documented their entire relationship through a series of secret letters that were never meant to be seen by anyone else. Letters that reveal the true cost of love during wartime. Letters that show us what happens when humanity triumphs over hatred, even in the darkest of times. I spent months authenticating these documents. I worked with handwriting experts, historians, and archivists across 3 different countries. Every single letter has been verified as genuine. Every date, every location, every detail has been cross-referenced with military records from both the British and German archives. What makes this discovery so extraordinary isn't just the love story itself. It's what these letters reveal about the human condition during war. It's the way they show us that even in the most divided times, even when the world is literally tearing itself apart, love finds a way to bridge the deepest divides. The first letter was written by Anna on March 15th, 1943. She was 24 years old, working in a makeshift hospital just outside Calais. Klaus was 26, recovering from a wound to his shoulder after being captured during a failed reconnaissance mission. According to military records, he was supposed to be transferred to a prisoner of war camp within 48 hours. But something went wrong with the paperwork. Or perhaps, as I've come to suspect after reading these letters, something went very right. Klaus remained in that field hospital for 3 weeks. 3 weeks that would change both of their lives forever. In her first letter, Anna writes about the moment she first saw Klaus. She describes him as broken, not just physically, but emotionally. She talks about how the other nurses refused to treat German prisoners with anything more than basic medical care. But Anna was different. She saw something in Klaus that others missed. She saw his humanity. Klaus writes about that same moment from his perspective. He describes being terrified, not of dying, but of living as a prisoner. He talks about expecting cruelty, expecting hatred, expecting to be treated as less than human. Instead, he found kindness. He found someone who looked at him not as an enemy, but as a person who needed help. Their correspondence began innocently enough. Anna would leave small notes with Klaus's medication, simple messages about his recovery, instructions for physical therapy, encouragement about his healing progress. Klaus would respond with equally simple thank you notes, written in broken English on scraps of paper he managed to find around the hospital. But, as the days passed, something deeper began to emerge in their writing. They started sharing stories about their lives before the war. Anna wrote about her childhood in the English countryside, about her dreams of becoming a teacher before the war changed everything. Klaus shared memories of his family's farm in Bavaria, about his love of literature and his hope of becoming a writer someday. What strikes me most about these early letters is how ordinary they are. Strip away the context of war, remove the fact that they were supposed to be enemies, and you're left with two young people getting to know each other, two people discovering that they shared the same fears, the same hopes, the same dreams for a peaceful future. By the end of Klaus's second week in the hospital, their letters had evolved into something much more significant. They were no longer just patient and nurse. They were two people falling in love in the most impossible circumstances imaginable. Anna writes about sneaking extra food to Klaus, about staying late after her shifts just to sit with him and practice English conversation. Klaus describes counting the hours between Anna's visits, about learning to write more fluently in English just so he could express his feelings more clearly in his letters. But with love came danger. Anna writes about the constant fear of discovery. She describes having to hide their letters, having to be careful about how long she spent with Klaus, having to maintain the appearance of professional distance whenever other staff members were around. Klaus writes about his own fears, but they were different from Anna's. He was terrified not just of being discovered, but of what his feelings meant. He had been raised to see the British as enemies, to view them as obstacles to German victory. Yet here he was, falling in love with a British nurse who had shown him more kindness than he had experienced in years. The complexity of their situation becomes even more apparent when you read about their discussions of the war itself. These weren't two people who simply ignored the conflict raging around them. They were acutely aware of the impossibility of their situation. They talked about it constantly in their letters. Anna writes about her brother who had been killed in action just 6 months before she met Klaus. She describes the guilt she felt for caring about a German soldier when her own family had suffered so much at German hands. Klaus writes about his friends who had died fighting the British, about the loyalty he felt toward his comrades even as he fell in love with their enemy. What makes their letters so powerful is how they navigated these contradictions. They didn't pretend the war didn't exist. They didn't ignore their divided loyalties. Instead, they talked about them openly, honestly, with a maturity that seems remarkable for two people so young. In one particularly moving exchange, Anna writes about a night when the hospital received casualties from a recent battle. She describes treating wounded British soldiers who had been injured fighting Klaus's countrymen. She writes about how she could barely concentrate on her work because all she could think about was Klaus, and how wrong that felt. Klaus responds with equal honesty about his own conflicted feelings. He writes about hearing news of German victories and feeling simultaneously proud and ashamed. Proud because his countrymen were succeeding. Ashamed because those victories meant more suffering for Anna's people. These weren't simple love letters between star-crossed lovers. These were complex, nuanced exchanges between two people trying to make sense of love in a world that had gone completely mad. Two people trying to hold on to their humanity while everything around them pushed them toward hatred and division. The turning point in their correspondence came during Klaus's third week in the hospital. Anna writes about receiving news that Klaus would finally be transferred to a proper prisoner of war camp. She describes the panic she felt, the realization that once he left she might never see him again. It was then that they made a decision that would define the rest of their relationship. They decided to continue writing to each other, even after Klaus's transfer. They would find a way to maintain their connection despite the war, despite the distance, despite the enormous risks involved. But how do you maintain a secret correspondence with an enemy prisoner of war? How do you send love letters across battle lines without being discovered? How do you keep love alive when the entire world is trying to tear you apart? The answer to those questions lies in the remaining letters and what Anna and Klaus were willing to risk for love, what they were willing to sacrifice, what they were willing to give up for the chance to be together. But their story was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous and dramatic chapters were just beginning. The method they developed for continuing their correspondence was both ingenious and incredibly risky. Anna had befriended a French resistance member named Marie who worked in the hospital laundry. Marie had connections throughout occupied France, a network of people who moved messages and supplies between resistance cells. Through Marie, Anna learned about a system that could potentially carry letters across enemy lines. Klaus, meanwhile, had been transferred to Stalag Luft III, a prisoner of war camp in Poland. The camp was notorious for its strict security, but Klaus discovered that some prisoners had established their own communication networks. Fellow inmates who had been captured at different times from different units often brought news from the outside world. More importantly, Klaus learned that some prisoners received packages from family members that weren't always thoroughly inspected. Their first successful exchange after Klaus's transfer took nearly 2 months to complete. Anna wrote her letter on tissue-thin paper, rolled it tightly, and concealed it inside a small metal tube that Marie smuggled to a contact in occupied France. From there, the letter traveled through a chain of resistance operatives, black market traders, and sympathetic civilians before finally reaching someone who could get it into the prison camp. Klaus received Anna's letter hidden inside a loaf of bread that arrived with a Red Cross package, and he later wrote that he nearly wept when he unrolled that first letter and saw her familiar handwriting. For weeks, he had wondered if she had forgotten him, if their time together had been just a wartime fantasy that would fade once he left the hospital. But Anna hadn't forgotten. Her letter was filled with details about her daily life, her work at the hospital, her dreams for after the war. More importantly, it contained a plan for how they could continue writing to each other. She had worked out a system with Marie's contacts, a way to send letters approximately once every 6 to 8 weeks. Klaus's response revealed just how much their separation had affected him. He wrote about the darkness of prison life, about the way hope seemed to drain from prisoners as months turned into years. He described fellow inmates who had given up entirely, who spent their days staring at walls, waiting for either liberation or death. But Anna's letter had changed everything for him. Suddenly he had something to live for again. He had a reason to survive whatever hardships the camp might bring. He began planning his response immediately, working out his own system for smuggling letters out of the camp. The ingenuity they displayed in maintaining their correspondence is remarkable when you consider the resources available to them. Anna began saving every scrap of thin paper she could find. She learned to write in increasingly small handwriting to fit more words onto each precious sheet. She developed a simple code system, referring to Klaus by different names in case their letters were intercepted. Klaus became equally resourceful. He learned to make ink from berries and charcoal. He practiced writing on scraps of cardboard until he could create letters small enough to hide in the most unlikely places. He established relationships with other prisoners who had their own smuggling networks, trading favors and information for the chance to send his letters to Anna. Reading these letters today, what strikes you most is not just their love for each other, but their absolute determination to maintain their connection despite impossible odds. They wrote about everything and nothing. Anna described the changing seasons in England, the way spring flowers looked after a long winter, the taste of real coffee when the hospital occasionally received supplies from home. Klaus wrote about the small victories of prison life, a successful vegetable garden that prisoners had cultivated in secret, a theatrical performance that inmates had organized to boost morale, the arrival of new prisoners who brought news from the outside world. He wrote about learning Russian from a fellow prisoner, about reading books in 3 different languages, about the way education had become a form of resistance against the dehumanizing conditions of camp life. But beneath these ordinary details lay something much deeper. Their letters became a form of mutual survival. Anna wrote about particularly difficult days at the hospital, about losing patients she had grown attached to, about the exhaustion that seemed to seep into her bones after months of constant work. Klaus responded with encouragement, with reminders of her strength, with promises that their sacrifice would eventually lead to something better. Klaus wrote about the brutal realities of prison life, about friends who died from disease or despair, about the constant hunger that gnawed at prisoners despite Red Cross packages, about the way some men turned cruel under the pressure while others became more generous than they had ever been in freedom. Anna responded with stories of hope, with news of Allied victories, with plans for their future together once the war ended. Their correspondence evolved into something neither of them had expected when they first met in that field hospital. They were no longer just two people in love. They had become each other's lifeline, with each other's reason for surviving a war that seemed determined to destroy everything good in the world. By early 1944, their letters had developed a rhythm and depth that reflected their growing intimacy, despite the physical distance between them. They wrote about their families with increasing honesty. Anna revealed that her parents had disowned her brother for refusing military service, that her family was far more complex and troubled than she had initially admitted. Klaus wrote about his father's enthusiasm for the war, about political arguments that had torn his family apart long before he was drafted into military service. They began planning for after the war with increasing specificity. Anna wrote about a small cottage she had seen advertised for rent in the Lake District, about how she imagined they could live there together once peace returned. Klaus responded with detailed descriptions of the life he envisioned for them, complete with vegetable gardens and evening walks and quiet mornings spent reading together. But as 1944 progressed, their letters also reflected the growing intensity of the war around them. Anna wrote about increased casualties at the hospital, about rumors of a major Allied offensive that everyone hoped would finally turn the tide. Klaus wrote about changes in the prison camp, about increased security measures, about the way guards had become more nervous and unpredictable as news of German defeats began filtering through even the most controlled information channels. The danger of their correspondence was escalating along with the intensity of the war itself. Anna wrote about a close call when another nurse nearly discovered one of Klaus's letters hidden in her personal belongings. Klaus described a terrifying incident when guards conducted a surprise inspection of prisoner quarters and came within inches of discovering his writing materials. Yet they continued writing. They continued taking enormous risks for the chance to maintain their connection. Reading their letters from this period, you can sense both their deepening love and their growing awareness that time might be running out. The most remarkable aspect of their wartime correspondence wasn't just that they maintained it for so long, it was how their relationship continued to evolve and deepen despite the impossible circumstances. Through letters alone, they developed the kind of intimacy that most couples take years to achieve through daily contact. They wrote about their fears with complete honesty. Anna admitted that she sometimes wondered if Klaus would still love her after seeing how the war had changed her. Klaus confessed that he worried about being worthy of Anna's love after everything he had witnessed and done as a soldier. But they also wrote about their dreams with increasing confidence. Their plans for after the war became more detailed, more specific, more real. They wrote about children they hoped to have, about careers they wanted to pursue, about the kind of life they would build together once the world returned to sanity. What neither of them knew was that their greatest test was still ahead of them, as 1944 turned into 1945, as the war entered its final and most chaotic phase. Their love story would face challenges that would make everything they had endured so far seem simple by comparison. The letters from this final period of the war reveal two people who had been transformed by their love for each other, but who were about to discover just how much that love would cost them. The winter of 1945 brought changes that would test Anna and Klaus in ways neither had anticipated. Anna's letters from this period reveal a woman grappling with exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. She wrote about nights when she could barely sleep, haunted not just by the wounded soldiers she treated, but by the growing realization that the war was reshaping her in fundamental ways. Klaus's situation at the prison camp had deteriorated significantly. Food rations had been cut again. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Most concerning of all, rumors were spreading among the prisoners about what might happen to them as Allied forces closed in on German territory. Some guards spoke of transferring prisoners deeper into Germany. Others whispered about darker possibilities. In February 1945, Anna received a letter from Klaus that was different from all the others. His handwriting was shakier, the paper rougher than usual. He wrote about a conversation he had overheard between guards discussing the possibility of evacuating the camp. But what struck Anna most was the tone of his letter. For the first time since their correspondence began, Klaus sounded truly frightened. He wrote about prisoners who had simply disappeared one day, officially transferred but never heard from again. He described the way conversations among inmates had shifted from planning for after the war to simply hoping they would survive the next few weeks. Most heartbreaking of all, he wrote about his growing fear that he might never see Anna again, that their love story might end not in reunion, but in silence. Anna's response to this letter reveals the depth of her commitment to Klaus. She made a decision that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. She began researching ways to help Klaus escape from the prison camp. Through her connections with Marie and the Resistance Network, she learned about prisoner rescue operations that were being planned as Allied forces advanced into occupied territory. The plan that emerged was audacious and incredibly dangerous. Marie's contacts had identified a route that could potentially get Klaus from the prison camp to a safe house in occupied France. From there, other resistance members could help him reach Allied lines. But the operation would require precise timing, enormous luck, and resources that Anna didn't possess. Anna made another decision that reveals just how much Klaus meant to her. She began selling her personal possessions to raise money for Klaus's escape attempt. She sold jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, books she had treasured since childhood, even her winter coat. Every penny went toward funding what she knew was likely a hopeless mission. Klaus's letters from this period show a man torn between hope and despair. Part of him was elated by the possibility of escape, of finally being reunited with Anna. But another part of him was terrified by the risks Anna was taking on his behalf. He wrote repeatedly about his fear that she would be discovered and punished for helping an enemy prisoner. The correspondence from March 1945 reveals the final preparations for Klaus's escape attempt. Anna had managed to get word to him about a specific date when resistance fighters would create a diversion near the prison camp. Klaus would have a narrow window of opportunity to break away from a work detail and meet contacts who would help him begin his journey toward freedom. Reading these letters today, knowing what we know about the chaos of the war's final months, it's remarkable that Anna and Klaus maintained any hope at all. The plan they had developed was dependent on so many variables beyond their control. Weather conditions had to be right. Guards had to follow predictable patterns. Resistance contacts had to be in position at exactly the right time. But what choice did they have? Klaus's letters make clear that staying in the prison camp was becoming increasingly dangerous. Conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Prisoners were dying from disease and malnutrition. Some were being transferred to locations from which no word ever returned. For Klaus, the escape attempt represented not just a chance to reunite with Anna, but possibly his only chance of survival. Anna's final letter before the escape attempt is one of the most moving documents in their entire correspondence. She wrote about her love for Klaus with an intensity that seems to leap off the page even today. She described everything she wanted to show him about her world, every place she wanted to take him, every experience she wanted to share. But she also wrote about her fears. She admitted that she sometimes wondered if their love could survive the transition from wartime correspondence to peacetime reality. They had fallen in love through letters, sustained their relationship through imagination and hope. What would happen when they were finally together in person, dealing with the ordinary challenges of daily life rather than the extraordinary circumstances of war? Klaus's response reveals a man who had thought deeply about the same questions. He wrote about his own fears of disappointing Anna, of not living up to the person she had imagined through his letters. He worried about the psychological scars that prison life had left on him, about whether he could ever fully return to the man he had been before the war. Yet both of them remained committed to taking the enormous risks their plan required. Their love had sustained them through 2 years of separation, through dangers neither had imagined, when they first met in that field hospital. They were willing to risk everything for the chance to discover whether that love could survive in peacetime. The escape attempt was scheduled for March 28, 1945. Anna's letters from the days leading up to this date reveal a woman oscillating between excitement and terror. She had arranged time off from the hospital, officially to visit family, but actually to travel to the location where she hoped to reunite with Klaus. She had prepared false identity papers, civilian clothes for Klaus, and enough money to help them disappear until the war ended. Klaus's final letter before the escape attempt is brief but powerful. He wrote about his gratitude for everything Anna had done for him, about his amazement that someone could love him enough to take such enormous risks on his behalf. He promised that regardless of what happened during the escape attempt, he would spend the rest of his life trying to prove worthy of her love. What happened on March 28, 1945 would determine not just the fate of Anna and Klaus, but the entire trajectory of their remarkable love story. The letters that document this period reveal two people who had been transformed by love, who had discovered depths of courage and commitment they never knew they possessed. The resistance operation began exactly as planned. Marie's contacts created a diversion at the prison camp by sabotaging a nearby railway line. Guards were called away from their usual posts to investigate the explosion. Klaus, working with a detail of prisoners repairing camp fencing, saw his opportunity and slipped away into the forest surrounding the facility. For 3 hours, everything proceeded according to plan. Klaus made his way to the designated meeting point where resistance fighters were waiting with civilian clothes and forged identification papers. They began the dangerous journey toward the safe house where Anna was waiting, traveling through back roads and forest paths to avoid German patrols. But wars rarely unfold according to anyone's plans, and the chaos of Germany's collapse in 1945 created dangers that no one had anticipated. A German military unit retreating from advancing Allied forces happened to be using the same route that Klaus and his rescuers were traveling. The encounter was brief but devastating. Anna waited at the safe house for 3 days before receiving word about what had happened. Klaus had been recaptured just 12 miles from where she was waiting. The resistance fighters who had helped him were either dead or missing. The carefully planned reunion that had sustained both Anna and Klaus through months of preparation had ended in disaster. The final letters in their correspondence come from this period, and they reveal two people grappling with the collapse of everything they had worked toward. Anna wrote about the devastation she felt upon learning of Klaus's recapture. She described feeling as though her heart had been physically torn from her chest, as though the world had suddenly lost all color and meaning. Klaus's letters from his new prison facility reveal a man struggling against despair. He had been transferred to a camp much closer to the front lines, where conditions were even worse than at his previous location. More importantly, the brief taste of freedom he had experienced during his escape attempt made his return to captivity almost unbearable. Yet even in these darkest moments, their love for each other remained unshaken. Anna wrote about her determination to find another way to help Klaus, to develop another plan for getting him to safety. Klaus responded with letters begging her to abandon any rescue attempts, to focus on keeping herself safe until the war ended. Their final exchange of letters reveals the profound maturity their love had developed over 2 years of impossible circumstances. They wrote about accepting that they might never be reunited, about finding ways to honor their love even if they couldn't share their lives together. Klaus wrote about carrying Anna's memory with him as a source of strength regardless of what happened. Anna wrote about the way loving Klaus had changed her understanding of what it meant to be human. The last letter in their correspondence is dated April 15, 1945. Klaus wrote about rumors that Allied forces were approaching his location, about the possibility that liberation might finally be at hand. He wrote about his hope that he might survive to see Anna again, but also about his acceptance that survival was beyond his control. What Klaus didn't know when he wrote that final letter was that Anna had not given up on finding him. She had spent weeks tracking down information about his new location, working with resistance contacts to develop another rescue plan. She was determined to reach him before the advancing Allied forces arrived, convinced that the chaos of liberation might provide their best and last opportunity to reunite. The story of what happened next, the final chapter in Anna and Klaus's extraordinary love story, would test everything they had learned about love, sacrifice, and survival during their 2 years of wartime correspondence. Anna's determination to reach Klaus before liberation forces arrived led her to make the most dangerous decision of her entire war experience. She abandoned her post at the hospital without official permission, using her accumulated leave time as cover for what she knew might be a one-way journey into occupied Germany. The resistance network that had helped with Klaus's failed escape attempt was largely dismantled, but Marie had managed to connect Anna with a different group of operatives working closer to the front lines. The plan they developed was desperate and improvised. Allied bombing had created chaos throughout German transportation networks, but it had also created opportunities for people willing to take enormous risks. Anna would travel disguised as a displaced German civilian, carrying forged papers that identified her as a refugee fleeing from advancing Soviet forces in the east. The story was plausible enough to explain her presence in areas where few civilians remained. What makes Anna's journey so remarkable is not just the physical danger she faced, but the psychological transformation she underwent during those weeks in April 1945. Her letters from this period, written to Klaus but never sent, reveal a woman who had discovered reserves of courage she never knew existed. She wrote about traveling through bombed cities where entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, about sleeping in destroyed buildings and abandoned railway stations, about the constant fear of discovery by German patrols or Allied bombing raids. But she also wrote about moments of unexpected humanity that sustained her during the darkest parts of her journey. German civilians who shared their meager food supplies with a stranger. Allied soldiers who looked the other way when they encountered a lone woman traveling through restricted areas. Resistance fighters who risked their own safety to help someone they had never met before and would never see again. Anna's search for Klaus took her through 3 different prison camps before she finally located the facility where he was being held. Each camp presented its own challenges, its own dangers, its own heartbreaking encounters with prisoners who had given up hope of ever seeing freedom again. At the first camp, she learned that Klaus had been transferred just days before her arrival. At the second, guards initially claimed to have no record of any prisoner matching his description. The third camp was different from the others in ways that immediately filled Anna with dread. It was smaller, more isolated, surrounded by evidence of recent violence. The guards she encountered seemed nervous, unpredictable, desperate in a way that suggested they knew their authority was rapidly disappearing. Most concerning of all, the camp appeared to be preparing for evacuation, with prisoners being organized into groups for transport to unknown destinations. Anna's approach to this final camp required every skill she had developed during her weeks of traveling through war-torn Germany. She observed the facility for 3 days, learning the patterns of guard rotations, identifying the most vulnerable points in the perimeter, watching for any sign of Klaus among the prisoners she could see during exercise periods or work details. On the 3rd day of observation, she saw him. Klaus was thinner than she remembered, his face marked by the hardships of prison life, but unmistakably the man she had fallen in love with 2 years earlier. He was part of a work detail repairing damage to the camp's outer fence, guarded by 2 soldiers who seemed more interested in watching for approaching Allied forces than in closely supervising their prisoners. Reunion that followed was nothing like what Anna and Klaus had imagined during their months of correspondence. There was no time for the emotional conversations they had planned, no opportunity for the gentle reacquaintance they had both hoped for. Instead, Anna had perhaps minutes to convince Klaus to attempt another escape, this time with even less preparation and planning than their previous attempt. Klaus's initial reaction was to refuse. He had been recaptured once before, and he knew the consequences of another failed escape attempt would be severe, possibly fatal. More importantly, he was terrified that Anna would be caught and punished for her involvement in his escape. He begged her to leave, to return to safety, to abandon what he saw as a hopeless mission. But Anna had not traveled hundreds of miles through occupied Germany to be turned away by the man she loved. She had information that Klaus didn't possess, intelligence gathered from resistance contacts about the camp's planned evacuation. Prisoners were being transferred to facilities deeper in German territory, locations from which liberation by Allied forces was far less likely. This might be their last opportunity to escape before Klaus disappeared into the chaos of Germany's final collapse. The argument that followed, conducted in whispered conversations during brief moments when guards were distracted, reveals the depth of feeling that had developed between Anna and Klaus during their 2 years of correspondence. Klaus argued that he would rather face whatever fate awaited him in German captivity than see Anna risk her life on his behalf. Anna countered that she had already risked everything to reach him, that turning back now would make all her sacrifices meaningless. What finally convinced Klaus to attempt escape was not Anna's arguments about their future together, but her description of what she had witnessed during her journey through Germany. She told him about the camps she had seen that had already been evacuated, about prisoners who had simply vanished without trace, about the growing desperation of German forces as they retreated toward their homeland's heartland. Klaus realized that staying in the camp offered no guarantee of safety, that the choice was not between risk and security, but between different types of risk. At least with Anna, he would face those risks with someone who loved him, someone who had already proven her willingness to sacrifice everything for their relationship. Their escape plan was necessarily simple given the limited time available for preparation. Anna had identified a section of the camp's perimeter where recent bombing had damaged the fence enough to create a potential exit point. She had also located an abandoned farmhouse approximately 3 miles from the camp where they could hide until Allied forces arrived in the area. The escape itself unfolded with surprising smoothness, at least initially. Klaus managed to slip away from his work detail during a shift change when guards were momentarily distracted by reports of approaching Allied aircraft. He made his way to the damaged section of fence where Anna was waiting with wire cutters borrowed from resistance contacts. For the first hour after leaving the camp, everything proceeded according to plan. Anna had chosen their route carefully, avoiding main roads and staying within forested areas where they were less likely to encounter German patrols. Klaus, despite his weakened condition after months of inadequate food and medical care, managed to keep pace as they made their way toward the abandoned farmhouse. But their luck ran out just as the sun was beginning to set. A German patrol, conducting a sweep of the area in response to Klaus's reported escape, encountered them less than a mile from their intended hiding place. The confrontation that followed would determine not just the immediate fate of Anna and Klaus, but the ultimate resolution of their extraordinary love story. The patrol consisted of 3 soldiers who appeared to be barely out of their teens, nervous and inexperienced in a way that made them potentially more dangerous than seasoned veterans might have been. They were clearly operating under orders to recapture escaped prisoners at any cost, but they were also obviously frightened by the rapidly deteriorating military situation around them. Anna's response to this crisis reveals the extent to which her wartime experiences had transformed her. Rather than panic or despair, she immediately began calculating options for survival. She spoke to the soldiers in fluent German, identifying herself as a refugee, and claiming that Klaus was her husband, who had been conscripted into labor service. The story was plausible enough to create momentary confusion among the patrol members. Klaus supported Anna's deception by remaining silent, allowing her to control the conversation while he assessed their captors for signs of weakness or opportunity. His months of prison experience had taught him to read the moods and intentions of guards, and he quickly realized that these soldiers were more afraid than aggressive, more concerned with their own survival than with strictly following orders. The standoff that developed lasted for nearly 30 minutes, with Anna continuing to maintain their cover story, while the patrol leader radioed for instructions from his superiors. Klaus and Anna used this time to position themselves as advantageously as possible, moving gradually toward cover, while appearing to comply with the soldiers' demands. What happened next would become the defining moment of their entire relationship, the event that would determine whether their 2 years of love and sacrifice would end in tragedy or triumph. The radio communication between the patrol and their commanding officer was interrupted by the sound of approaching artillery, evidence that Allied forces were much closer than anyone had realized. The young soldiers, faced with the choice between dealing with 2 captured escapees and retreating to avoid advancing enemy forces, made a decision that surprised everyone involved. Rather than follow their orders to return Klaus to prison, they chose to abandon their posts and flee toward German lines. In the chaos of their retreat, Anna and Klaus found themselves alone in the German countryside with Allied liberation just hours away. But survival was far from guaranteed. They were still deep in German territory, surrounded by retreating enemy forces and advancing Allied armies. Artillery fire was increasing in frequency and intensity. Most dangerous of all, the abandoned farmhouse they had planned to use as shelter had been destroyed by recent bombing, leaving them without secure hiding place as night approached. The next 18 hours would test everything Anna and Klaus had learned about survival, about love, and about the kind of commitment required to build a life together in the aftermath of total war. They were finally together, finally free, but their ordeal was far from over. Far from over. The destroyed farmhouse forced Anna and Klaus to seek shelter in a partially collapsed barn about half a mile away. The structure offered minimal protection from the elements, but more importantly, it provided concealment from the military activity that was intensifying around them throughout the night. Klaus's weakened condition from months of imprisonment was becoming increasingly apparent as adrenaline from their escape began to wear off. Anna found herself in the unexpected role of caretaker and protector. She used skills learned during her nursing training to assess Klaus's physical condition, discovering that malnutrition and untreated injuries had taken a greater toll than his letters had revealed. His shoulder wound from the original capture had never properly healed. His hands showed signs of frostbite from the harsh winter in the prison camp. Most concerning, he had developed a persistent cough that worried Anna deeply. But Klaus's physical challenges were matched by psychological ones that became apparent during their first night together in freedom. He startled awake repeatedly, calling out names of fellow prisoners who had died in captivity. He spoke in fragments about things he had witnessed, experiences too terrible to fully articulate even to the woman who had risked everything to find him. Anna realized that the man she had fallen in love with through letters was both exactly who she had imagined and completely different from her expectations. His intelligence, his sensitivity, his capacity for deep feeling were all present exactly as she had hoped. But the war had marked him in ways that their correspondence had only hinted at. This was not the gentle reunion they had both fantasized about during their months of separation. Yet something remarkable happened during those difficult hours in the collapsed barn. Rather than being disappointed by the reality of their situation, Anna found her love for Klaus deepening in ways she had not anticipated. Seeing his vulnerability, his struggle to readjust to freedom, his efforts to protect her even in his weakened state, revealed aspects of his character that letters could never have conveyed. Klaus experienced a similar revelation about Anna. Her courage in traveling through occupied Germany to find him was impressive in the abstract. But witnessing her practical competence under extreme pressure was something entirely different. She rationed their limited food supplies with the efficiency of someone trained in wartime scarcity. She kept watch while he slept, alert to dangers he was too exhausted to notice. She tended his injuries with gentle skill that reminded him why he had first been drawn to her in the hospital. As dawn approached on what would prove to be their final day in occupied territory, both Anna and Klaus understood that their relationship had entered a new phase. They were no longer sustained by hope and imagination, but by the immediate reality of caring for each other under the most challenging circumstances possible. The morning brought sounds of approaching Allied forces, but also evidence that German resistance in their area was intensifying rather than collapsing. Artillery exchanges became more frequent and closer to their location. Most ominously, they began hearing small arms fire that suggested infantry combat was developing nearby. Klaus's military training allowed him to interpret these sounds in ways that civilian Anna could not. He realized that they had inadvertently positioned themselves in what was likely to become an active battlefield. Staying in their current location would be extremely dangerous, but moving during daylight hours carried equally serious risks. Their discussion of these options reveals how completely their relationship had evolved from their early correspondence. Klaus no longer tried to protect Anna by making decisions for her. Anna no longer deferred to Klaus's military experience without question. Instead, they analyzed their situation together, combining his tactical knowledge with her practical skills and local intelligence gathered during her journey. They decided to risk daylight movement toward what appeared to be Allied positions, reasoning that the danger of remaining in place outweighed the risks of exposure during travel. Klaus's condition made rapid movement impossible, but Anna had identified a route that offered reasonable concealment while leading away from the intensifying combat. Their journey that morning took them through landscape that bore witness to the war's devastating impact on civilian populations. They passed through a village that had been completely abandoned, its residents either fled or worse. Gardens that should have been showing signs of spring growth instead lay barren and neglected. Farm animals wandered loose, their owners nowhere to be found. But they also encountered signs of hope that reminded them why their love story mattered beyond their personal happiness. In one destroyed house, someone had left a cache of food and medical supplies with a note indicating they were intended for refugees or escaping prisoners. The handwriting was shaky, possibly elderly, but the message was clear. Even in the midst of total war, some people refused to abandon their humanity. Klaus broke down when they discovered this gift from an unknown benefactor. The combination of physical exhaustion, emotional strain, and gratitude overwhelmed his ability to maintain the stoic demeanor that had helped him survive prison camp. Anna held him while he wept for everything they had lost, everything they had endured, and everything they hoped to build together. This moment of vulnerability became a turning point in their relationship. Klaus stopped trying to be the strong protector he thought Anna needed and allowed himself to be human in her presence. Anna stopped trying to be endlessly optimistic and acknowledged her own fears about their future together. For the first time since their reunion, they were able to talk honestly about what they had experienced and what it meant for their relationship. They spent the afternoon of that final day in occupied territory, having conversations they should have had 2 years earlier. Klaus told Anna about the guilt he felt for surviving when so many of his fellow prisoners had died. Anna described the way treating wounded soldiers had changed her understanding of violence and sacrifice. They talked about their families, about the ways the war had damaged relationships that might never be repaired. Most importantly, they began planning for a future that was no longer just fantasy. Klaus admitted that he had no idea how to transition from military life to civilian existence, that he feared being unable to support Anna or contribute to a peacetime society. Anna acknowledged that she had changed in ways that might make it difficult to return to the life she had known before the war, but they also discovered that their love had evolved beyond the romantic idealism of their early correspondence. They loved each other not despite the ways the war had changed them, but because of the strength and resilience those changes had revealed. They were no longer two young people dreaming of an impossible romance, but two adults committed to building a real life together regardless of the challenges that lay ahead. As evening approached, the sounds of combat began moving away from their location, suggesting that the front lines were shifting. Klaus's assessment of the tactical situation indicated that Allied forces had likely secured the immediate area, making it safer for them to seek contact with liberating troops. Their approach to the Allied positions required careful consideration. Klaus was still technically an enemy prisoner of war despite his escape. Anna was a British citizen operating without authorization in occupied territory. Both situations could potentially lead to complications with military authorities regardless of their personal circumstances. They decided to approach together, with Anna taking the lead in initial contact while Klaus remained close enough to support her story, but far enough away to avoid immediate detention. The plan reflected the partnership they had developed during their brief time together in freedom, combining practical strategy with mutual protection. The first Allied soldier they encountered was a young American private conducting a routine patrol near what had recently been German defensive positions. His reaction to finding a British nurse and an escaped German prisoner traveling together in the middle of a combat zone was initially one of complete confusion. Anna's explanation of their situation required several repetitions before the soldier understood what he was hearing. The idea that a British medical officer had traveled hundreds of miles through occupied territory to rescue a German prisoner with whom she had fallen in love was so far outside normal military experience that it took considerable time to establish credibility. Klaus's decision to surrender himself immediately to Allied custody helped convince the patrol that their story was genuine. His willingness to accept attention rather than attempt to escape or deceive the Americans demonstrated that his primary concern was Anna's safety rather than his own freedom. The processing that followed their initial contact with Allied forces took several days and involved multiple interviews with intelligence officers who were trying to determine whether Anna and Klaus represented a security risk, a propaganda opportunity, or simply an unusual human interest story that had emerged from the chaos of war's end. Anna and Klaus were officially reunited on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. They married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Allied Processing Center where Klaus was completing his reintegration procedures. Their wedding photograph shows two people who had been transformed by war, but not defeated by it. Anna still wore her nursing uniform because it was the only formal clothing she possessed. Klaus wore a civilian suit provided by refugee services, but his eyes held the same gentle intelligence that had first attracted Anna in that field hospital 2 years earlier. They settled in the Lake District cottage Anna had written about in her letters, the one she had imagined during their darkest moments of separation. Klaus never became the writer he had dreamed of being before the war, but he taught literature at a local school for 37 years. Anna returned to nursing, eventually becoming head of a hospital that specialized in treating veterans with psychological wounds from combat. They had 3 children together, raised them to speak both English and German, and never spoke publicly about their wartime correspondence until Klaus was diagnosed with dementia in 1987. Anna began sharing their letters with historians then, believing that their story deserved to survive, even if their memories could not. Klaus died in 1991. Anna lived until 2003, spending her final years working with peace organizations and corresponding with young people around the world who faced their own impossible circumstances. She often said that love had not conquered war, but it had survived war, and sometimes survival was victory enough. Their letters remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of courage and compassion can transcend the hatred that divides nations. Anna and Klaus proved that love between enemies was not just possible, but necessary. Their story shows us that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it encounters another human heart in need. In a world that seems increasingly divided, their correspondence offers hope that understanding between peoples is always possible, always worth pursuing, and always worth the risks involved. Sometimes the most important victories happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when one person chooses to see the humanity in another.